Hello, and welcome to the World of Autism podcast, a podcast about all things autism. I am Dr. Jeff Knight, and I'm on a mission to create hope, peace of mind, freedom, and confidence for these children with autism, and in serving their families to help create the happiest, healthiest versions of themselves. In this podcast, we dive deep in creating many different solutions, talking about resources, and providing insight and stories of hope for families that suffer and have challenges with autism. Please join with me, and I look forward to connecting with you. Hey guys, it's Dr. Jeff Knight. I just wanted to give you a quick heads up on the episode today with Dr. Andrew Hill. We're going to be diving into neurofeedback. This is a non-invasive way to help retrain the brain and brain waves. He has had incredible success with things such as seizures, also improvements with sleep, with dealing with sensory processing issues, trauma, stress, anxiety, all sorts of different things. You'll want to stay and listen to the whole episode. And just to give you a heads up, the first part is we geek out a little bit. So if you're not into all the technical talk about the brain and brain waves, you may want to speed through some of that first part. You'll get into the meat and potatoes a little bit later on. So just want to make sure you guys were aware. And also Dr. Hill gives a great offer at the very end for people to take advantage of his brain mapping. So you'll want to listen and get engaged with that as well. Look forward to hearing from you guys and hope you guys enjoy. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Jeff Knight from the World of Autism podcast. I am extremely excited to be with you today and to introduce our guest, Dr. Andrew Hill. He is an expert on all things neurofeedback, and I'm really going to be so interested in hearing what he has to teach us today. Just to give you a little bit background on Dr. Hill, he is the founder of Peak Brain Institute and a leading neurofeedback practitioner and biohacking coach for clients worldwide. He has lectured on psychology, neuroscience, gerontology at UCLA's Department of Psychology, where he received a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. At Peak Brain, Dr. Hill provides individualized training programs to help you optimize your brain across goals of stress, sleep, attention, brain fog, creativity, and athletic performance. He is the host of the Head First podcast and continues to do research on attention and cognitive performance. Dr. Hill, it's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Dr. Knight. Really appreciate it.
You betcha. That is an awesome bio and quite the history of different things that you've been a part of. The PhD in cognitive neuroscience, that sounds extremely interesting. I want to hear a little bit about that before we jump into our podcast. Tell me a little bit about that experience, what you learned, and what were some of the big takeaways through that education.
Sure. Thanks for asking. So, cognitive neuroscience, for those folks who aren't familiar, is kind of this overlap of mind and brain, how the brain produces the mind to some extent, or the resources of the mind, like attention, speed of processing, anxiety, those sorts of things. So before I was in grad school, maybe 3 or 4 years before, I was working in psychiatric hospitals, and I got injured and couldn't keep doing the sort of hands-on, floor-based, milieu counselor, psych tech kind of work I was doing. And I left human services for a while, went into technology, and then I got kind of missed human services, went back into working in an autism center on the East Coast. And I had had over a decade of working with really acutely developmentally disabled people across different complaints and diagnoses. And I had kind of seen it all at that point as a, kid in his late 20s. And I started working in this autism center and was really surprised at what I was seeing. It was a mix of developmental disabilities and neurodevelopmental challenges. So we saw everything from really severe nonverbal autism with stimming and seizures, all the way through very, very high functioning, social quirkiness, so to speak. And then we had a lot of ADHD and other types of, broad childhood things going on. And I had experience with all that stuff in critical environments. And as far as I knew, you couldn't change any of it.
Right.
And working in this environment, I was seeing people move through executive function challenges or sensory issues or anxiety or sleep phenomena or seizures, and seeing them change these things in a matter of weeks sometimes or a couple of
Mm-hmm.
months. And it was shocking against what I thought was possible, having come from a more traditional, inpatient residential environment where it was basically holding patterns and revolving doors, and you would sort of
Right.
see, some palliative work, but not a lot of progress. And then in this environment, I was seeing increased eye contact and people that had severe spectrum difficulties, really obvious dropping away of seizures. And it really struck me as, well, wait a minute, what's going on? It seems like there's something here we don't understand, doesn't seem to make sense. And at the time, the field of neurofeedback, this is again 25 years ago, basically,
Mm-hmm.
there was about three or four different schools of thought in the field who all had very different ideas about how this stuff worked. And they would have these really massive debates on the old Usenet before the current internet. And we would go back and forth, and lots of, very extreme personalities arguing about the right way to do it and what it was and what you were wrong. And yet all the four schools of thought were getting better results on ADHD, anxiety, seizures, all kinds of
Wow.
things than traditional medicine. All of them were. And yet the ideas were not reconcilable.
Hmm.
So that really is what made me go back to grad school, because I was like, well, we have a blind men and elephant situation happening here.
Yeah.
Everything like pieces something they're describing, but no one really understands the overall phenomena. So
Right.
went to grad school, UCLA, and I started studying neuroscience, basically. And as my experimental work, for my dissertation, I ended up doing a neurofeedback experiment looking at when you do neurofeedback, you train individual locations or frequencies in the brain to sort of move a little bit. And we were still kind of in the dark ages of the field. I mean, we still are in many ways for the brain. But at that point in the neurofeedback landscape, there were still open questions of, well, does it matter where you put the wires? Does it matter which frequencies you're exercising? And
Mm-hmm.
most of the field, 95% of them were like, yes, of course it matters, different effects. But there was a school of thought out in the fringes saying any feedback to the brain provides a mirror and the brain can learn from it. And so I did an experiment to prove to demonstrate, does frequency matter? Does sight matter?
Hmm.
And is it real? Is neurofeedback real? Can you actually do a thing to the brain and see it in real time? So we did individual locations in the head, left or right hemisphere. And we trained either a real beta wave phenomena up and theta down, and I can unpack that a bit later. Um, and we either did it on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, with two different frequencies, or a sham where we
Okay.
didn't a placebo-controlled feedback
Mm-hmm.
where it was
Yep.
beeping and the games were reacting not to the person's live EEG, but to signals that were stored on disk that were someone else's,
Okay.
were blended to the screen to create the continuous EEG. When you pull the wires off and move, you kind of see it. So we create a double-blind phenomena where you could hide the sort of canned nature of the EEG we're training off of, and then made the game screens and the neurofeedback react not to the contingencies of the person sitting there, but to some random contingencies that were not actually that person's brain. And so
Mm-hmm.
what I saw in my research was, yes, first of all, sight matters. Training on the left, you get a stronger desynchronization, a burst of brain waves right after you applaud it. So let me back up and describe the mechanism because this will make more sense.
You bet.
When you're doing neurofeedback, classic neurofeedback, it's a form of operant conditioning. You're exercising the brain waves in a certain direction, and it's mostly involuntary. You can't feel your brain waves.
Right.
You can't really change them. So one example of brain waves you might want to exercise, there's two big circuits on either side of the head, kind of in the middle, the precentral gyruses or gyri. The one on the left stabilizes your voluntary action, keeps you on when you're on, keeps you focused, keeps you vigilant. It also keeps you asleep at night. So it maintains the mode you're in. The one on the right supervises the mode and knows if you're on the right road, where you should turn, if you're doing the thing you want to do. Both of these circuits use beta waves to do their job, and they can get kind of they can fall over into thetas and alphas. Alpha is a neutral, theta is a release brainwave. If you make too
Mm-hmm.
much theta on these circuits, we call that ADHD.
I
If you make
gotcha.
too much alpha, we call it inattentiveness or ADD or ADHD PI. So you also get sleep maintenance issues when you have inattentiveness. You also get physical issues. You can't sit still when you have that impulsivity, but it's a function of beta waves. So I was wondering, and this is a classic thing in the field to do, is you train up beta on one side or the other, you train down the thetas. And so the way you do that is you stick wires there and measure the brain wave someone's making in real time, kind of fluctuates.
Hmm.
And whenever their brain briefly shifts in the right direction, the beta goes up and the theta goes down on its own. The computer sees that and goes, ah, good job, brain, yay. And a
Yeah.
game runs, a little Pac-Man moves or puzzle pieces fill in. The brain says, ooh, stuff, kind of like stuff.
Right.
Then it moves in the wrong direction. And the game slows down or stops. And the brain says, hey, I don't like no stuff. And then it happens to move in the right direction and the game resumes its applause. So the big trick here is removing the goalposts. Every few seconds, we're adjusting the software to chase the brain so that it only applauds absolute movement in the proper direction, or
Yeah.
relative, I guess that is. So it takes about 2 or 3 sessions to feel anything, maybe four, maybe five.
Hmm.
And often when you're doing neurofeedback, we're kind of iterating, trying this, seeing how it affects sleep or stress or mood or eye contact, trying this. And you iterate like a personal trainer would over time. And it's a little bit of an art to learn one person's needs and brain and how they're responding, how to communicate with them or their parents. So it's always been this really time and attention intensive process of a coach or clinician working with somebody to help them move through these processes. So part of my questions for grad school were, well, is there some way we can accelerate that process? And what is happening in the first handful of sessions? Does this mean that people aren't getting effects for the first 3 or 4 sessions? I mean, people do feel it the first time sometimes, but
Right.
it's rare. Does that mean that everyone's not getting effects the first 4 sessions, or what's happening? So I did 5 sessions in a row for my big grad thesis, Monday through Friday.
Okay.
We put those 2 wires on the left and right side, and we're doing the training or sham. We put a full head 64 channel cap on top of that,
Oh, wow.
and then yoked the feedback events from the software into the ongoing 64 channel record as events, and then constructed what are called ERPs, evoke potentials, meaning how is the brain reacting to the auditory and visual stimulus of the reward being released. And I hope there's some people who get geeky on this podcast because let me describe now what an ERP is, an event related potential. Whenever something happens in the outside world, your brain reacts to it. And there's lots of things happening in your brain right then that are not reacting to that stimulus. They're just background processes. So if you take a bunch of EEG of signals, you have these events in them, and you clip out segments of EEG with 1 second before and after the event, and then you average all of the segments together, you have events that are time locked to the thing you're trying to measure, and lots of stuff that's not time locked, out of phase with stuff you're trying to measure, and it all goes to zero. So what you end up with is this characteristic waveform that's responding to the one thing you care about. So I did the ERP of the reward event, i.e., is the brain noticing the beeps and the gameplay?
Yeah.
And it was. And you had as a burst of brain waves after the beep happens. And it happens on the side of the brain where you're measuring the brain waves. It happens in the frequency you're measuring. So if I'm measuring 12 to 15 beta, 12 to 15 hertz beta, you get a burst in 12 to 15 hertz after you applaud it. If you're measuring 15 to 18 hertz beta, you get a burst in faster beta waves like that right after you applaud it. If you're measuring sham, you don't get that burst of desynchronized brainwaves.
Yep.
So I did 5 sessions, and I was expecting that somewhere in there, maybe session 4, maybe session 5, a certain percentage of people I'd be able to tell neurofeedback was happening. And we could both answer the sham and placebo questions. We could also answer the left and right frequency specific, site specific questions. And I was really curious about, well, when is it starting? How does the brain yoke to that signal? When is that thing coming in? Turns out the first 5 minutes. I broke every half an hour training session out into 3 10-minute blocks and did the ERPs for each 10-minute block. The
Wow.
very first 10 minutes, which has 700 or 800 events in it potentially,
Mm.
within 3 or 4 minutes in, most people are starting to show that burst of brainwaves in response to the applause and that brainwaves. And
Wow.
I mean, almost without fail, it was happening, and most people weren't feeling it.
Yeah.
So
And that's even in the first session.
the first 10 minutes of the first session, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you can watch the CRP evolve throughout the session as the brain learns to react to it. And you can watch it evolve the first day, the third day, and the fifth day. You can see the brain learning to adapt to the information as it comes in. So
Wow.
that was my big dissertation work, was discovering uh, can you do the lateralized training in a sham way? I also did lateralized attention testing, looking at how attention resources work in each hemisphere separately, which is a big thing for our kid population is executive function. And so I was really deep at that point into ADHD and autism and those sorts of things. So still kind of am.
Yeah.
And I was really interested in this idea of, well, how can we reliably assess without, I mean, ADHD is a list of 18 characteristics you can observe and check off, but half the time it's trauma or fatigue or a sensory issue causing that behavior, not actually ADHD. So I was curious, can we assess executive function resources within each hemisphere separately? I was doing some cool research on that, and I found you can the last little bit of geekery here is that when I was doing that left versus right training, I found that you could change the attention performance within one hemisphere specifically as you were training the brain. So you get these separable or distinguishable orienting, alerting, and vigilance resources in each hemisphere that come together late to create the experience of attention. You can modify them side by side. You can just, oh, that left side isn't not as vigilant, bring it up, and this right side has
Mm-hmm.
this. So that was
Yes.
my PhD.
I love it. Well,
Thanks.
you took us down a really good path. I'm glad you shared all that because I was going to ask, how did you get into neurofeedback and the EEG stuff? One thing I think would be helpful is just to explain what an EEG is, and also some
Sure.
of our listeners might not know what a shams test is either.
Sure.
If you could just explain those briefly, that'd be helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah, you bet. So EEG are brain waves. The brain's made up of all kinds of different parts with specialized function, but there's one big chunk of it that is really, in some ways, uniquely human, the way the cortex, the surface, the bark of the brain is organized. It's a massive sheet of tissue that's kind of crumpled up together to give it a lot of surface area in a very small region. And if you took a perpendicular cross section of the cortex, you would see a six-layered structure.
Yep.
And the cortex is made up of something called microcolumns or sometimes mini columns. One is microvolts, one is one size, one is electricity. But the point is, you have these structures that are six layers and they contain 30,000 neurons, roughly,
Mm-hmm.
and 100,000 potentially support structures like glial cells and other support structures. So think of this like New York City with a big giant building, and the whole building is kind of contiguous and it has an internal environment. And that whole little micro column will fire, will release its energy all at once. Every cell in there will fire synchronously, has the same electrical field, basically. And the rate at which it fires is a brainwave. It fires twice per second. It's a delta brainwave. And it's doing background metabolism, things like your sleep and your heart running and your, memory consolidation. If it's 4 to 7 hertz, 4 to 7 cycles per second or bursts per second, it's theta. Theta is a release brainwave. It takes the brakes off and lets things happen, which is why if you have all theta all the time, you're kind of ADHD or at least
Right.
disinhibited in some way. Alpha, running from 7 or 8 hertz up to about 12 hertz, around 10 is the average, 10 cycles per second. Alpha is the idling frequency. So it's the background rest frequency of the brain, kind of runs the idle of the brain. You also put individual circuits into alpha when you turn them off briefly, like you close the eyes, the visual tissue should go into a nice 10 hertz alpha wave because you're not using the visual tissue.
Sure.
You open the eyes, alpha goes away, gets replaced by the next frequency, which is beta. It's the processing frequency. It starts about 12 hertz and goes up about 40. And there's different betas in there, but essentially beta waves are the gas pedals and the gears. And those are very modular. You're very aware of them. Most of the mind, the thoughts, the experiences, the processing, the emotions, it's beta waves. So that's all the little modular stuff in the cortex. And then above beta, you have gamma, which you can't really measure with anything outside of a very, very expensive lab. And gamma is involved with aspects of consciousness. You can break gamma time synchronization with theta and create unconsciousness. This is what anesthetics do, is they change the timing within microtubules in the neurons, and that breaks the phase synchrony of 40 hertz gamma, 4 hertz theta. They nest, they ring together. If you break that coupling, consciousness goes away.
Mm.
And consciousness is altered when gamma is altered. So if gamma connectivity is reduced, you have schizophrenic type phenomena. If it's highly increased, you're probably looking at a long-term meditator. So
Mm.
it's an interesting phenomena, but it's kind of more esoteric and hard to measure
I
outside of the
gotcha.
lab.
Okay. That's great.
So those are brain waves. And
Awesome.
you'll make a combination of all the brain waves in each location to tune what it's doing, basically.
Yeah, and I've heard an explanation before of an EEG being similar to, just like you said, measuring the brain waves in the brain, similar to how the EKG measures your electrical activity of your heart. The
Yep,
EEG is measuring the electrical or the brain waves of the brain. Is that a
exactly.
pretty simple way
It
to
is.
define
Yeah,
that,
it's
would
the
you
same
say?
kind of wires. It's electrodes. You're measuring passively. The one thing I will say that where they're quite different.
Sure.
Most of us have seen an EKG waveform. It's the same
Yes.
waveform every time,
Yep.
theoretically. It should be, anyways. You can glance at it. And if it's distorted in a certain way, that means something about the health.
For sure.
If you see brain waves that regular, like the heartbeat, it's a seizure.
Yes.
And if the heart looks like a brain wave, it's a heart attack.
Right.
It's very similar neurons, but they tend to live on the other ends of regulatory stability, chaos about to fall over, or ultra regulation about to shut off. That's the heart versus the brain.
Sure.
That same neurons, largely in many, many ways, they're these information processing bits. So yeah, EEG, the process of recording your EEG is to put a cap on the head or individual wires everywhere. And then you sit
Mm-hmm.
still for about 10 or 15 minutes, eyes closed and the same eyes open, and get some baseline like fingerprints. So these are not the evoked potentials, the events I mentioned. These are more like resting patterns you always have. We call them phenotypes or uh, uh, features in your brain. They're hard to understand. One person, people are weird, so good job, be weird.
Yep.
But it's a stable pattern. When you look at an EEG, it's something you usually have sitting there, a trait marker, basically.
Nice. And based off of those, that EEG or the brain mapping, then you can determine a lot in terms of how to best help that individual. For example, if you had someone that had symptoms of ADD or challenges with focus, or maybe they have a hard time sleeping or regulating their behavior, would you could you do you think you could predict what their brain map would look like knowing their symptoms, or do you find that symptoms aren't always accurate with what the brain is showing in the brain map?
They're definitely not always accurate because people are
Okay.
not diagnoses. But yes, I can usually cold read a map and tell people all these things about themselves they already know,
Yep.
and they're really surprised I can see. And I can
Yeah.
do that about 95% of the time. I can go, oh, I mean, I don't do this. I don't say, here's what's happening for you. I say, let me teach you to read data. And I'll walk through all the unusual features for you and describe what's plausible. Your job is to disbelieve it. Let's see what
Yeah.
survives that. And
Right.
and usually I guess between six and a dozen things as we walk through data. And I do about 20 or 25 of those every week with people
Mm-hmm.
individually. Um, there's about one person a week who says no to a couple of things.
Okay.
It's a fairly like, oh my gosh, you can see that. And the stuff we can see, the stuff we can reliably spot are these regulatory features in the cortex. And that includes the executive function tissues I mentioned. That includes anxiety, because most flavors
Yeah.
of anxiety are not disease process. They're dysregulated individual circuits like front midline. Our kids that tick and have obsessive stuff and OCD, that's front midline anterior cingulate. Or back midline posterior cingulate is your lifeguard. Watch the road, heads up. And that can be a trauma response or some visceral fear. Behind the right ear, the tempoparietal junction is really germane to our podcast audience. That's the social and sensory junction box. So I
Yeah.
looked at your brain and saw, whoa, Dr. Jeff, you've got all this beta hanging out in high gear behind your right ear. That tends to mean people have a hard time filtering the world as it hits them. Are you mad at your partner for chewing too loud? Is eye contact a little uncomfortable? Do you find people's voices in coffee shops super annoying? Oh, you do. How's humor for you? Oh, it's not that great. Okay, well, you may have a touch of difficulty processing with this tissue. Is that uncomfortable? Does that matter to you? I'm never here to say, here's a problem. I'm here to say, here's your brain.
Yeah.
Can we interpret it? Is it important? And what do you want to do now? Like it's
Yeah.
it's just your brain. Let's,
Yeah.
let's push it around.
Oh,
So
that's good. I like that. That's really good. That's neat. Another question I often have, especially with individuals on the autism spectrum,
mm,
what what do you feel is the most common presentation you find with individuals on the autism spectrum when it comes to brain waves? Do you find certain patterns that are pretty consistent, or do you find that, again, we know everyone is so unique, and every brain is very unique. And even at certain times of day or even times of the month, brains might be a little more different, but there is, of course, patterns that we can trust. So,
Yeah.
what do you see in those types of individuals?
So very true that one person who suffers from some autistic function stuff is not like anyone else often.
Yep,
But I will say that there is no autism brain signature.
I gotcha.
What there are the individual circuits that all of us have that tend to cramp up in autism and more quickly or more aggressively because of connectivity changes. So many of us have perseverative obsessive stuff. It's a lot more common in autism.
I gotcha.
Many of us
Hmm.
have social anxiety or sensory integration issues or an auditory processing issue, much more common in autism. Many of us have seizures, much more common in autism. These are regulatory features. So there's about 8 things I can see reliably in a brain map, big gross features of the brain. Many of them cramp up in, developmental complaints, so to speak. Executive function, anxiety, sensory processing, social processing, speed of processing, and then stability phenomena like seizures and migraines. Those are sort of things that are conserved across people. And if you have really major social input difficulty in terms of social cueing or verbal prosody, if you don't have any productive language, it might be autistic, but it could be something else too. It could be, trauma response or brain injury or just being a little quirky. So again, I tend not to be in this diagnostic perspective. If someone comes in and, or their parent brings them in or their caretaker and they're not making eye contact and they're flapping and they're screaming, it's a different kind of, brain. And you're going to see an awful lot of like hot nervous system stuff.
Yeah,
But a kid who's autistic and that impaired socially won't look that different from a cognitively and socially and verbally intact kid who has reactive attachment disorder and
yep,
another like really hot brain because of early privation. You'll see very similar stuff, these hyper aroused kind of systems. Most people who aren't that extreme, you wouldn't know on a brain map somebody has social function difficulty and that is acute, that is autistic level acute. You might think they were quirky, but you can't tell the signature in that right tempoparietal area apart. Looks the same if you're socially not cueing appropriately or if you're over empathetic. If you're the deepest, richest, empathetic, emotionally sensitive person and it's a little raw, you're a therapist, you have crazy empathy that's just really rich and you're social cueing better than most people, that looks really similar to being flooded and not able to parse that out and having that sort of shutdown of social processing that can happen in spectrum people. Can't tell it apart in a brain map. But I can say your social and sensory are a little quirky. Is that important to you? Oh my gosh, yes, it's important to me. Great. So I'm playing this little trick where I instead of diagnosing, I'm kind of thrusting agency upon people by teaching them
yeah,
things.
yeah.
But
I think that's smart. I mean, especially in this field with neurofeedback, I know you can't be so exact with diagnosing certain things.
right,
But as we know, and as I mean, you and I know that neurofeedback can do some incredible things for people. I've seen some amazing things in the years that I've been around it, with everything from, you know, calming down an OCD brain to some anxiety, insomnia, challenges with depression, of course, focus, even you mentioned trauma. I've seen people with chronic headaches that have responded well, or even migraines,
yep,
to where they've been able to get out of that funk. I know some of the common symptoms that a lot of individuals on the spectrum do have. I would say you've already touched on some of them, which is focus. I would say the stimming and the behavioral, maybe being more quick to have a tantrum or blow up at mom, dad, brother, sister, whoever, whatever it is. Um, those are some of the things that I know most families are really concerned about.
yeah.
So how confident are you in providing assistance with families like that struggle with getting their kids to get a good night's rest, or maybe they struggle to fall asleep, but then another kid struggles to stay asleep, or
Yeah.
maybe it's some of the traumatic responses, like the tantrums and whatnot. um, share with us maybe some of the experiences or what you've seen, or some of the positive things that have come from you, the type of work you've done with a lot of individuals over the years.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of people at this point, 25
Yeah,
years in. I think that probably the important thing people might want to know is what can be changed and maybe
yeah,
what can't. And
sure.
that's really important in the autistic spectrum landscape because if somebody's into neurofeedback, if they do it, or if they've experienced it and gotten some good effects, and many people do, most people do, people in the field tend to think it's magic and it fixes everything. And it can do incredible things. Um, but there's some things that it's much, much harder to do. And so when it comes to autism, the sort of threshold for deciding, is this a feature that you're going to get really huge change in? Again, there's these regulatory features, and then there's other features that have a more of a critical period. They lock down a little bit. So, for instance, language. If somebody's, 9, 10, 11 years old, mostly locked down and developmentally in language, and they don't have productive language or receptive language, it's going to be really hard to create change in those tissues. But language is about the hardest thing to work on. And that's a big deal in autism. That's why I'm mentioning it.
Yeah,
It's actually really hard to shift. I've seen it shift. I've seen nonverbal kids who haven't spoken once in their life at age 8 or 10. So they can grab mom's hand and say, Mommy, I love you. Everyone in sight breaks into tears at that point.
right,
But
for
it's
sure.
rare. It's rare in autism. It does happen, but it's rare. What usually happens is the other stuff is reliable. Executive function, like if you have typical language, then almost everything else you can move. Motor system, if you have a brain injury and some spasticity, that can be hard to move. Or visual fusion, if you have a strabismus that was corrected late, that's hard to move because it's
Yeah,
critical tissue.
yeah,
But executive function is meant to keep moving. So is anxiety, so is sensory, so is social, so is speed, so is sleep. These are meant to change. So in executive function, I do a lot of executive function testing. We get pretty reliably 2 standard deviations of change in 3 months of training.
mm,
So 50 sessions of training, 40 to 50, 2 full standard deviations on a bell curve. When someone comes in with ADHD and autism, AUDHD, it's called now, I guess.
okay,
Seeing that term everywhere. I don't know if it's an official term or if it's a Facebook mom's term, that's showing
right,
up, but I'm seeing AUDHD everywhere now.
okay,
But that combination, when I got in the field, you couldn't have both. You were either, and now you can be both officially.
okay,
Um, but the executive function stuff, I do so much executive function testing. Every brain map we do a go, no go style executive function test every single time, along with the EEG, which is, and the go, no go is more valid for picking out executive function, speed of processing, that kind of stuff. And we get reliably 2 standard deviations in anything that looks like ADHD. And you can get about 1 standard deviation every 20 or 25 sessions for ADHD type phenomena. Anxiety type phenomena change almost as reliably.
okay,
So, be that stimming or a tic or generalized anxiety with a sleep maintenance issue, same thing. That's an anxiety phenomena for many people. Sleep is the third leg of that stool. So, stress, sleep, and attention are the three big foundational resources, and they all move reliably. Sleep onset, sleep maintenance, sleep cessation, bedwetting, they all move reliably under the caress of neurofeedback. You can find the phenomena, you can stretch it, get a subjective effect, and then double down on it. And
nice,
then there's some things that are a little harder. You can make change in, but you have to kind of know the person's brain, work with them for a while. Those include the sensory processing, the social processing. I have clients who, when I met them, had no eye contact and would talk like this all the time and had no sense of, verbal prosody. They couldn't have a lilt in their tone.
right,
Because they couldn't hear the prosodies, they didn't reproduce the prosody. So instead, they were talking like this all the time.
yeah,
And I have several clients that are the most gentle, mellifluous speakers now who make eye contact, who hear emotion differently, because the only thing they had was that one little thing that we're working on essentially as a core. Actually, both of those people I'm thinking of as the biggest cases, they also had what brought them in as adults. Both of them actually. They came in and said, my sense of humor is not very good. I want a better sense of humor.
okay,
All right, see what we can do. And we improved sense of humor. One of them, it wasn't lasting. Most things in neurofeedback, you get enough change in and it becomes stable because the brain is training sorry, practicing all the time with the stuff you've trained up. So you get this stability. There's some things we do with autism and also concussions and also migraines. It's a vascular training process. You wear an infrared camera that points inward and it measures waves of heat coming off the brain.
Hmm.
It's called HEG, passive infrared chemoencephalography. And you
Okay.
yoke that to a real-time signal on the screen and have some audio, ding, 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 ding. And the person concentrates or thinks happy thoughts and the surges go up. You create a
Hmm.
vascular pumping in the brain. And this seems to, I've been using it for years for post-concussion and for migraine. It works really well to really, really reduce the intensity and eventually the incidence of migraines. But we started seeing that this one tool, I don't know why, brings up social function. Suddenly
Hmm.
eye contact, crisp up, humor, verbal prosody, and a lot of those things are not near the frontal lobe. They're more in the back and the right and the temporal lobe. So for some reason, doing that blood flow training on the frontal lobe can bring up a lot of deep features around social function. So social and sensory change more slowly, but other tools can be supportive. Seizures change really fast. Like the
Wow.
average reduction in seizures in the literature with like 30, 40 sessions of training is 50%. I've never seen a result as poor as 50%, not once. It's always like, okay, those seizures mostly went away in the first couple of months. Seizures tend to push back a little bit. You know, there's this tissue developing a little kindling focus, and it can be hard to extinguish. But ADHD, OCD, PTSD, sensory triggers, intrusive fears, sleep dysregulations, these things all generally spend a few months kind of working out and then they are stable and changed. So I would say for my clients who have some spectrum needs, I really have maybe two categories of them. One are people who have mild to moderate needs and they make some change. The change is great and they're, off doing their own thing now after 4 to 6 months of training. Then I have clients with slightly increased level of need, um, and we train their brain and they have a really large change, but they have a long way to go. And
Yeah.
so I'm now working with those people, once a year, twice a year for a few months at a time. And, one guy who's in his late 20s now, when I first met him, couldn't be independent. He had lots of really intense anger and obsessiveness. He would bite down on things, get really frustrated. And he lives semi-independently with a roommate who models typical behavior. He goes to work on his own. He cleans up at a restaurant. And every so often, once a year, he still gets frustrated and embarrasses himself. But he competes in swimming. He joined a community play recently and actually learned all the lyrics. And I mean, he's living a full life as opposed to living in his mom's living room, unable to have social contact. He's actually got a very rich life.
That's
So
neat.
I'm still working with him, but once a year we do either 2 months or up to 6 months because if he's having a rough time, we do a little bit more. And each time we get a little bit more of a lift and a little bit more of a thorough change. He's just got a long way to go before his challenges wouldn't be in his way because he's got a lot of impairments basically. But with subtle impairments, you can drop away the obviousness where really you have an autism diagnosis? Never would have guessed. And with really
Yeah.
severe stuff, you can help calm the nervous system so parents can go to sleep at night and
Right.
push microwave buttons without getting attacked and things like that.
Yeah. Sure.
So
Wow. That's great. I love that. And I appreciate you being open with letting us know that, hey, not this isn't like the magic bullet, right? This isn't the magic wand that's going to fix everything. I think that's so important for these families because you and I both know how much of an investment most of these families have put into trying to
yeah,
provide care for their kids. And so, of course, any ounce of hope they have, they want to grab onto it. So it's important for them to at least understand here's the reality. You can explore this and potentially have some positive changes. But as far as the language go, from what I heard, it's very unlikely for that to
yeah.
change.
Yeah, I
Maybe
mean, you might get
very,
lucky there, but you're
yeah,
more likely to
very,
help the
very
kid's
few.
anxiety or something, because
Exactly.
the same person's going to have sensory issues, anxiety, not sleep
Yep.
well, be
Exactly.
frustrated, and that's going to respond. So
Exactly.
suddenly they're not going to maybe have great language, but they might be silly with you and have fun at dinner and, not be
Yes.
frustrated, sleep more deeply at night. And
Exactly.
that is night and day. pun intended, with, everything else.
For sure.
So,
No, and I love that because it sounds like, there are certain things you're very confident with in terms of things that can change fast. As far as the seizures go, that's wonderful to hear. I know that there's some neurofeedback therapeutic approaches that utilize glasses with lights that flicker
mm,
or flash.
yeah.
Is that something that your systems use as well, or is that something you don't use?
I don't use it. I think you're describing AVE, audio visual entrainment, like the David Paradise devices and things that do light stim. There's also some neurofeedback that will do driving, photic driving, along with doing neurofeedback. I don't. I used to do those. I used to use those tools when I was working in environments where we had all of the different tools and we're trying everything with really acute populations. I don't think entrainment works that well. I don't think humans have much of a frequency following response. The auditory binaural beats thing doesn't seem to do anything in human brains. And most of the stim, the light and sound stim devices, I don't think do a lot, is the short answer.
Okay.
Entrainment in general is kind of weak for humans. We can train, we can learn to change the brain, but picking up outside signals and resonating with them isn't a thing we do really strongly. So I don't use the sort of entrainment devices. Instead, we're sort of waiting for the brain to shift briefly and applauding what it's just done and teaching it to move versus kind of imposing an external state. I
I
find that
gotcha.
it's more subtle, but it creates change instead of maybe just creating a brief event. So
Okay. Oh, that's helpful because, and the reason I even brought that up, I've heard that individuals that have seizure don't do the
mm,
glasses because that usually is very
right.
stimulating in a negative way for them. So,
Yeah, it's one of the ways to look for seizures is you sleep deprive somebody and then you flash strobe lights in their eyes.
yeah.
But the sleep depth creates the visibility of the seizure. It like doubles if you have somebody with a seizure disorder and you sleep deprive them, you're now twice as likely to see a seizure in the EEG. If you
Wow.
photic stim, you add a few more percentage points.
Okay.
Most people are not that sensitive. Back in the 80s, that Pokemon TV show came on and people all over the world had started having seizures from it. And it was because it was a specific photic driving, but I mean, it's rare that that happens even in sensitive people. So, yeah.
Okay.
But no, photic is kind of weak as an intervention. I'd rather people do other things because they're, more impactful.
Right. No, yeah, it just made me think of the infrared heat that you're using, which for migraines and headaches and what was the other thing? It even helps stir up some of the emotions you
Yeah,
said.
it does timing, it does social context. I don't know why.
Yeah,
So
that's
this HEG
fantastic.
system, I actually have one, it's within reach. I'll show you its little infrared headband. And besides this, I also do some stimulation, not to say I don't do any stim. This is the HED device. It's just basically a forehead camera and you
Okay.
point it in at the brain, it measures the waves of heat as it comes off. So it's really easy to
Okay.
use. This
Yeah.
is this is also nice with really severe autism because you aren't like sticking wires to the kid's head, making them sit
Yeah.
still. You can sit here and rock and stim with this on your head. No
Right.
problem. It still measures heat.
Yeah.
But I also use photobiomodulation. So red
Okay.
light therapy helmets where you're stimulating the mitochondria at
Mm-hmm.
1070 nanometers of deep red light. And that seems to spin the electron chains of mitochondria very, very quickly and create a lot of mental energy. So
And will
you can tune the brain by using red light pulses is the
okay.
theory.
Will you do that separate or do you do that in conjunction like with the neurofeedback?
Depends on the individual. I don't use the red light, the photobiomodulation with everyone, so I don't use the HEG device with everyone.
I
HEG I
gotcha.
use with autism, with migraines, with concussions,
Okay.
maybe other stuff like post-COVID. The red light therapy helmets I use whenever there's a metabolic signature of some sort, concussions, COVID, all the other stuff, but also aging. If you put the red light therapy helmets on, you get this rejuvenating effect subjectively. You feel calm and a little bit energetic. So the red light therapy helmets I would use 5 days a week, the PBM, photobiomodulation. EEG training, that's too much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You won't melt your brain, but you'll feel like it's melting. You'll throw your sleep off, you'll overtrain. So EEG training is 3, maybe 4 times a week.
Okay.
HEG training can be done, same thing. And the red light photobiomodulation, maybe 5 days a week. But I often coach people on layering lots of interventions. So often, parents who are investing lots in their kid will have all kinds of things they're trying to do. So maybe I'll be helping the parent look through methylation analysis, Or maybe we find a local hyperbaric medicine center to do some dives in a high pressure chamber. Or maybe the person is wondering, how to do some body recomp, and we're talking about, weightlifting or something. I kind of don't care what your goals are as long as they involve your brain and you would like to get some coaching. Neurofeedback is iterative. It is coaching. How's your sleep? How's your stress? Let's try this. Let's try that. So then it really fits in well with wellness coaching in general, sleep hacking and meditation and macronutrients, bring the protein up and the
Yeah.
sugar down.
Yeah.
That matters for this population as well as everyone else with a brain.
Right.
So I tend to bring lots of tools on board, but it tends to be a mix of access, agency, resources, need, and we tend to construct an individualized plan for each person and move through supporting them for a few months. So
Okay. Yeah. That's great. I was going to actually ask you what are some additional therapy or things that you utilize to in tandem to really maybe create more value or add to the benefits of the neurofeedback. And it sounds like you just answered a few of those.
yeah, red light,
Hyperbaric.
yeah,
Yep. Red light.
hyperbaric,
Yep.
and meditation. We do a lot of work with mindfulness. We tend to we have mindfulness teachers at Peak Brain, and some of our clients do mindfulness instruction either in groups or one-on-one. One of our teachers, Samantha Snowden, wrote a book called The Anger Management Workbook for Kids, which you
Hmm.
can buy for 20 bucks on Amazon. And it's mindfulness exercises, 50 of them, helping you understand how you're feeling and how to control how you're feeling.
Hmm.
So while it's not specifically for spectrum people, that lack of awareness of our arousal level and what we're displaying, kind of important. And those are great exercises for folks that are cognitively and verbally intact, but might have some difficulty with regulating arousal levels or emotional access. A great way to dial into some body scanning strategies and some metaphors or mindfulness to think about how we're feeling and expressing emotions. So, little aside.
Nice. That's really neat. Yeah. So repeat that name of the book that you
Samantha
people.
Snowden is the author, and the book is um, Anger Management Workbook for Kids.
Okay.
50
Great.
mindfulness exercises to something, something, something emotions.
Okay. That's great. Wonderful. This is incredible. So, other things that, in terms of the neurofeedback with autism, so typically, what would you say would be a realistic amount of time? You mentioned 3 to 4 times a week, but how
Mm,
many sessions would you say for? And of course, we call it the spectrum for a reason. We know that everyone's across the board. There's so many different variations, but on average, if a family were to pursue neurofeedback
yeah.
and reach out to you and utilize your services, what would be the time frame commitment that they would most likely need to really look into to really see the benefits and results?
Yeah. If you're pretty high functioning, language is intact, cognition's fine, but you may have exacerbated anxiety, sensory, social, executive things. I would generally work with people like that for 4 months, maybe 6 months.
Okay.
And in 2 months, a lot of our programs are home based. We send you equipment, we work with you live until you're comfortable, and then give you, real time spot checks as you need. We do about 30 sessions or more in 2 months. So that means you might be doing 100 sessions in 6 months or
Yep.
110 maybe if you're really pushing it. That is a pretty good chunk of neurofeedback.
Yeah.
That's going to take somebody who's cognitively intact and take their sensory, their social, their executive, and their sleep and probably regulate it pretty thoroughly. Multiple standard deviations of change in data, a lot of change observed subjectively and from the outside. I mean, we get teachers calling home to parents all the time saying, "Thank you for finally putting Jimmy on stimulants." The parents like, "Oh, actually, we didn't. Haha." All the time. I got
That's
3 calls
great.
from that school. What are you doing over there? Um, so high functioning or typically functioning cognitively, but having the primary complaint of social or other types of things like that, really good change. You'd be done at some point. When I have people that are stimming, screaming, no language, little eye contact, a lot of developmental problems on top of just the autism social aspects. Some of those people I work with for a year, and we make some
Hmm.
really lovely changes, and they stop because it's just a lot of work to keep training the brain. That makes them change. Great. Other folks I train for a long time. And like I described this guy in his 20s, I think he's on session like 300 or something.
Wow.
So effectively, he's done 3 years of training with me, but he's done 3 years of training over 9 years.
I gotcha.
He did a initial 4 months, like really good results. Came back 8 months later when he was in a new job and getting overwhelmed, got sorted out, moved to a new house, had a new roommate 6 months later. His sleep wasn't getting regulated. So we did a couple of months and really worked on sleep. And we addressed the goal each time, but also got to move him up a little bit in social function, stress response, and other stuff like that. So it's also not the brain's not the zero sum. We can take anybody, regardless of your complaints, and go, oh, those are your goals? All right.
Sure.
Now, the worse things are, the faster they change. So if you're really deeply deficited in executive function, anxiety, social, you get really nice changes that are obvious and people see it in the data and in the person. But if you're already a super high performer, I think the rate of change is maybe half of what
Okay.
somebody who's like really impaired or has really obvious deficits. Um,
Yeah.
but that means that we can, for some people, like I have a couple clients, one client I'm thinking of who really socially awkward, verbal prosody was a little bit quirky, and yet he was a musical genius. He was a pianist who was just ridiculously good, beautiful jazz pianist, but couldn't get in a car without an anxiety attack, couldn't drive across a bridge without having a panic attack,
Wow.
couldn't make eye contact. And he had a really, really whiny voice, like he had that prosody
Yeah.
problem and very small stature, like developmentally, challenged. And I worked with him for only a few months. And a couple years later, he drove across country by himself, moved into an apartment by himself, and he now runs a jazz trio that tours the country. And he is the most low-key, chill guy. And he came back a couple years later for more training, for more training. So he's probably had a couple hundred sessions, but he didn't need to after the first chunk. He just went, oh, hey, you guys are in my new town that I moved to. Oh, yeah, I'm gonna do some more training because I'm feeling a little stressed with my travel schedule now. All
Yeah.
right, cool.
Now it's just optimizing function.
Yeah, and you would never know this guy had a autism diagnosis. He's a tiny bit quirky, but
Sure,
he's
but
a
aren't
he's a
we all?
gentle, right, exactly, right. I certainly am. I don't know
Right.
about you,
Me
but
too.
yes.
That's why I
So
said it.
right, right. The point is, if you can get the big point of pain out of the way, the diagnosis doesn't matter. And I'm
Sure.
not I'm not here to confirm or to deny a diagnosis for you. I'm here to help you understand some of the resources and then help you construct ways to make changes in those resources. So that's what we've done for 10,000 people roughly across 25 years. Now, Peak Brain's not been open for 25. We're about 9 years in now. I ran another company for 3.5 years before that. So for
Okay.
25 years, I've been running my own neurofeedback practices for half of that time, basically.
Wow.
So
Have have you seen a lot of changes in terms of technology over the years? Do you find that that's been any different, or do you feel in the sense for good or bad?
both good and bad. Yes, there's been a rush towards really complicated tech and really lots of bells and whistles. None of the newer tech works any better,
I gotcha.
but the cost of equipment has come way down. And the basic tech that does the good work has gotten slightly better. So when
Good.
I was involved in the field, 25 years ago, to buy a system, you had to spend around 20 grand in
Mm,
25-year-old money.
mm,
And that required two computers talking to each other over a parallel cable, one running games, one running signals, and had to like not have processing power on one computer. You had to use two. You had a technician in front of one computer and a client in front of the other. It was very, very involved, wires everywhere. And now you can do, this is an EEG amplifier used for home training. It's $1,000, retail, and the software is about $1,000. So for 2.5 grand or something, a whole system can be set up instead of 10 times that now.
right.
And I can do brain mapping. The device I use for an EEG, 20 years ago, you pasted 21 wires in someone's head and you had them sit there. And if someone's, doing this and stimming and flapping the whole time, it's really hard to get an EEG done. Well, now you put a Lycra cap on, squirt it full of gel, and step back. And 10 minutes after you start, you're recording data if you're good. So the technology's gotten slightly better. And the EEG amplifier for measuring full head data was 60 grand 25 years ago. It's 6 grand now.
Right.
So, yes, and that helps me do neurofeedback at scale around the world. But it's the same neurofeedback to a very large extent as it was when it was first discovered in the mid 60s.
Right.
So,
And that I'm glad you brought that up too. Not a lot of people know that it's been around for decades.
yeah,
So this isn't anything new. It's just something that gets underutilized, unfortunately. So
even brainwaves, EEG was only discovered 100 years ago this summer.
wow, that's amazing.
So, somewhat new, you know?
That is cool. And I want you to go a little deeper with you kind of touched on it just barely. So those individuals that are really have that highly sensory processing disorder where they just have a hard time with things on their head or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
Does this get in the way with those kids? Is there ways to work around that? Can you still help those individuals? Because I'm sure there's parents out there that are saying, there's no way my kid will let you put anything on their head or
Yep.
attach an electrode or whatever it is.
Yeah.
How do you work with those
The
individuals?
short answer is you just work with those individuals.
Yeah.
You just get them used to it. You do some desensitization. More than once, I've taken a broken EEG cap that had some broken wires inside of it and sent it home with the parent. The parent puts the cap on and wears it around the house until it's the kid's turn.
Okay.
Or some broken ear clips, and the parent
Yeah.
wears them around. To the kid's like, what's that? Oh, it's my earring. You want to try it? You know.
That's
So
yeah,
you can do that.
that's a great idea.
HEG, you don't have to sit still for. So kids that
Yeah.
are, moving a lot that way. Red light therapy, you don't have to sit still for. HRV, heart rate variability, you don't have to
Hmm.
sit that still for. So it can be challenging, but the full head cap, you only have to do at the beginning and then every other month. And
Okay.
it's pretty quick. It's 10 minutes to set up and 10 minutes, maybe 20 to record. So it's a pretty innocuous process for many people. If you have a lot of sensory integration issues and you're really active, it's going to be really hard to do.
Yeah.
And I have years ago started training folks without doing assessments. I try not to now, and I haven't had to. But I've had somebody who's really dysregulated, who had big needs, and couldn't tolerate, a cap, an assessment. I would still start training. I mean,
I
I would assume
gotcha.
I could see, I would kind of reverse brain map. Okay, eye contact is iffy, no verbal prosody. Oh, and seizures starting the left side. Oh, okay. I would kind of do a reverse brain map. And
Sure.
then once they stabilize, which should take a few weeks, where suddenly they can tolerate sitting still, they can tolerate caps in the head, then I would do the map if I
Okay.
had to. But
Yeah.
in general, parents are often like, my kid's not going to put up with this. And then you start training, the kid's like, the parents like,
Yeah.
holy cow, he's watching the movie. What? The kid, if you
For
move with the
sure.
wires in your head, it stops the game because you're adding
Yes.
mechanical noise. The kid's like
Yes.
goes, oh, it's not moving, and the kid's like just stops. And you can also do things with autism, especially really severe impairments. You find the one thing they love. That I can't tell you how many times I've watched the first 25 minutes of Shrek
Okay.
or the first 25 minutes of name a kid
Right.
movie from the
Sure.
90s. Like I
Sure.
cannot tell you hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. I used to leave my first center on the East Coast. I would go home and be like singing songs. Like, where's that song coming from? Oh, that's the second song in Shrek. Okay, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
It's like I had all these kids, having to watch
Oh,
all the
for
all the media
sure.
again and again.
For
Mhm.
sure. No, some of the kids I've worked with, it's like the same movie over and over again.
But the
And you
kid will
do,
sit still for that movie,
yes.
perhaps, because you can
Yes.
you can funnel into their obsessive interests the
Yeah.
one thing you have to if you
Yep.
need. So, like, I have a game where I create pictures out of different images. So, if you're really into Pokemon, your gallery is Pokemon, and it
Mm,
drops away showing more of the Pokemon, then changes the next card. Or maybe it's antique film. I don't know, whatever you're interested in. Create a gallery for you of art that matches your interest, and then unveil pieces of it slowly. That actually creates a lot more engagement than parents expect. Like, my kid's sitting still.
that's cool.
This neurofeedback is cool. Yeah, we haven't got effects yet. This is just putting in front of them the thing they want to work, they want to focus on. Oh, cool. Okay. So
That's
parents are
awesome.
much more concerned about the kids putting up with it than the kids ever are, or almost always. They usually enjoy it. It's kind of fun too to sit there and be like, as you sit still and calm, the car zips faster or the game starts to react, and you kind of feel it. You kind of like, ooh, that's me.
Yep.
So it's somewhat compelling in some very quiet way to like train your brain because it doesn't hurt. It's kind of weird and it kind of feels good afterward. If you land the right protocol for a couple hours afterwards, you're like, oh, I feel calm and focused. This is nice. And then it wears off and you have some changes later, but
Sure.
you get an effect. And if a kid sits there and puts up with it and then feels better afterwards, they know that.
Yeah.
And they associate with, oh, I have kids being like, brain training. I want brain training. Really? Okay.
Yep.
My kid's
Oh yeah.
asking for it now. What? Okay. It's from the same parents who are like, my kid's never going to do this.
Yeah.
Won't put up with anything. And then he's asking for it. Okay. All right.
Because
They
they know it's
know.
good for them.
They
Yep.
feel it.
They know
Exactly.
it.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's so cool. This is great. Dr. Hill, I've learned a lot today. I really appreciate this. Is there anything that we're missing that you feel would be really important for us to touch on before we wrap things up today?
We've touched on a lot. Um,
Yeah.
I will say two things. One is there's a lot of suffering, and even if we had completely typical brains, we can suffer. And so no matter if it's your quote unquote normal average anxiety or executive function issues or fatigue, or if it's really dysregulated resources, these things can change. And so, as I said at the beginning, language and other deep core aspects, social aspects that involve language, especially, they can be hard to change, but lots of stuff isn't. Brains are meant to change. So shift happens is my unofficial slogan. Get
Yes.
yours. The other thing I'll say is you don't have to be near one of our offices. Our fees are at or well below that of most people that do this work.
Mm-hmm.
You can work with us fully virtually if you're in the US or the UK or Sweden. You can rent equipment, grab hardware and software, work with our coaches 100% virtually. If you're in a different country, you can still work with us, but you got to buy gear. We don't have
Yeah.
offices in those other countries. So I guess the point is if your brain is not doing what you want, your kid, your friend's brain, your partner, find out about it first. Do a brain map. We're running a special for the listeners of the show. Normally, our brain mapping fee in one of our offices is $500. It's like a membership, and we're
Yep.
cutting it in half for listeners of this show. So it's $250 to get your brain assessed, and that includes repeats for the
Nice.
year. So it's a very low barrier. We hope barrier to entry to get some knowledge about your brain. And
Mm-hmm.
the brain map's not just meant to sell you neurofeedback; it's really meant to give you agency. If I show you your sensory, your social, your speed of processing, your sleep, your executive on a brain map, well, you may have some ideas about how then to go after it that are, lifestyle, medication, other biohacking. But maybe more importantly, when you see this stuff on a brain map, your suffering isn't instantly changed, but it's a whole lot harder to feel overwhelmed or ashamed or guilty about the stuff that's happening.
No doubt.
So know thyself, look at your brain. You'd be shocked at what you can often see, and it's worth doing. That's
You
my
bet.
big takeaway.
And your locations here in the US, remind us where those are at.
Yeah, so we're in New York City and Manhattan. We're in St. Louis. We're in Orange County in Costa Mesa. We're in Los Angeles on the West Side. And then many of our clients never see our offices. So just give us a
Yep.
shout and we can send you equipment and do some work with you as well that way.
That's fantastic. One thing I want to touch on is, and that I've witnessed over the several years I've worked with families, is I encourage mom and dad to get on this too, because
Yep.
the stress and the challenges that come with raising and helping your child that's on the spectrum, this is something that could be a way to give back to yourself as well.
Yeah.
Making sure that you're taking care of yourself so that you can also be at your best for your child, but also in every other area of your life. So this could be a family event or a family process of going through this journey together. And that's something I want to just throw out there too.
Yeah. The caregiver burden is no joke.
Oh yeah.
No joke. So, make sure you're putting the oxygen mask on yourself while
Yeah.
you're taking care of somebody else. There's a couple inflections to add about family work. Um, Boys often have their mama's brains, and
Hmm.
girls often have their aunts or grandmother's brains on the maternal side. So when
Hmm.
you do lots of family members, you start to see the same brain patterns. So even if someone's like got a really impaired autistic kid and they're not, they're socially intact, you can still see all the same anxiety stuff.
Hmm.
So it can
Interesting.
really be interesting to like start to unpack what's happening with siblings or yourself. And then the other piece is we have referral specials. So if you refer your friend in, or refer your kid in, refer yourself in, it earns your family an extra month of neurofeedback back to your plan. So kids on the spectrum often need some little extra training. So you do some training. Wow, it's working great for them. Well, maybe sign yourself up and get them an extra free month.
There you
So we
go.
have ways of the family that trains together tends to transform together or
There you
something. I don't
go.
know.
I like that. Well, this is great. Thank you. This is wonderful and so
Thanks.
generous of you to offer $250 off of an initial brain map. That is a really good value without a doubt. So neat that you can work with anyone virtually. I'm really curious about that personally. And as far as the brain map goes, do you send stuff out to the individuals to do stuff with the brain map and then they just
Do
mail it back to you?
exactly. Yeah. The coaches work
Okay,
live with you. It's not, we don't just set you free with equipment. It's kind of hard to use. So
sure.
the coaches do a live session with three-day window. We send you full head EEG systems. The coaches help you set up, put a cap on, squirt gel through
Use the
it.
gel. Yep.
Coaches are running the machine, making sure that the signal's looking good, having you troubleshoot. There's like 21 locations in the head. So they're helping you set up all of them, plus some ear clips. It's a little finicky.
Sure.
Guide it, we talk you through it. And we find we get better quality data doing remote guided EEGs than we do by sending somebody to a random provider who gathers them. It just is a much higher quality process if we can gather it in real time. And we have a 3-day window with the equipment in your hands, which means you can do an extra map with caffeine or your kid's medication, or
Yeah.
maybe we couldn't get through the stimming and jaw clenching enough. So, hey, keep the equipment, doing the recording tomorrow. So we
Yeah.
have a little bit of quality check window. And during that time, we can get extra maps to the family or have fun with it. So
Yeah.
then they send that back, and people generally keep the other system, which is like a laptop bag with, laptop and EEG training amplifiers and maybe HEG or whatever. And then they'll keep that for the length of the program. And the coaches work with our clients live for the first couple of weeks, doing guided sessions and helping teach you to do this. And then we give you a live private chat that's open for your family 7 days a week. So you can get real-time support, troubleshooting, wire replacement help. So you're never worrying, did I do it right? And what's this error message? You can just get on with the training and focus on the after effects, which only you can do is observe those. So.
Nice. Great. Well, awesome, Andrew. Thank you so much again. I appreciate your time, your expertise. I loved geeking out with you with some of those things. So that was a lot of fun. And I hope that families that are listening definitely take this a closer look, and I really encourage you to consider this, because this is one of those tools that can be a game changer for sure. So thank you for your hard work over the last 25 years, Dr. Andrew.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, hey guys, just if you like this podcast, please share this with friends and family, and definitely stay tuned as we will continue to bring more great content like this in the future. Thanks again. This is Dr. Knight from the World of Autism podcast. Have a good one.